Hi everyone, welcome to the Kelly Writers House YouTube live stream of a conversation between Heidi Kalloo and Karley Sciortino. So very excited for this. Heidi is our assistant program coordinator. They are interested in all kinds of super compelling stuff, from games and gaming to experimental literature. And so today they're taking that interest and they're going to have a conversation with writer of Sex and Sexuality, Karley Sciortino. I'm going to let Heidi introduce Karley, but a few notes real fast. We'll be sharing book links in the YouTube chat and a guest book, which you should totally sign. You should also like and subscribe, which is a fun new thing that we get to say at the beginning of all of these programs. And you should buy Karley's books, and those links will be shared as well. So stay tuned, stay involved, and if you have questions, drop them in the YouTube chat, and our diligent student staff will get them to Karley and Heidi. So thanks again, everyone. Here's Heidi.
Thank you, Allie. Hi, I'm Heidi, and I'm super excited to be doing this program today. Karley Sciortino is a writer, television host, and producer. She's the founder of Slut Ever, a website that focuses on sex and sexuality. And for the last 6 years, she's written for Vogue's sex and relationships column, Breathless. She also co-wrote the scripted comedy series Now Apocalypse alongside queer film icon Greg Araki. Her memoir, Slut Ever, Dispatches from a Sexually Autonomous Woman in a Post-Shame World, was published in 2018. She's also the host of the podcast Love in Quarantine, where in each episode we listen in on Karley's funny and intimate conversations with people who, just like us, are navigating sex and relationships during the apocalypse. Karley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Like, truly, this makes me feel cool, and it's an excuse to get dressed up.
You are really cool already.
Thank you. Yeah, when I was talking to Heidi before this, they were saying, that it would be interesting to talk about sex, dating, and relationships during this period of time. And I was doing this podcast. It's a podcast mini-series called Love in Quarantine, where I just was exploring intimacy and how the landscape of intimacy has been changing over this period of time. And I want to talk about, I assume a lot of people on this Zoom are dating and figuring out how to date in the era of social distancing. And first, I wanted to say a few words on something that I've been thinking about sort of in my daily existence recently, which is just like feeling sexy and what it means to feel sexy, and even if that's possible during this period of time. And I think that sort of for better or for worse, a lot of sort of feeling sexy for me comes from like performance, right? And I love clothes, I love makeup, and for many, many years I've loved dressing up and feeling good about myself and going to bars and going to restaurants and being looked at. And it's kind of maybe sounds like unfeminist to say that, but I do think that you get a lot of sexual energy from the world. And even if you're in a relationship, right? It's like, I'm in a long-term relationship. I'm not like prowling bars for sex 24/7, but I still like that feeling when you feel like you look good and you walk into a restaurant and you hold someone's gaze for just a little bit too long and feeling wanted. And I think that now so many of us, it's this cliche that you're wearing sweatpants all the time, but like truly the most glamorous place I go to now is like Trader Joe's. To which I'm like wearing a gown because it's my only opportunity. And my main social event is every week I go and sit in this patch of like basically dried grass next to CVS and drink beer out of thermos with my friends. And, I'm not really getting dressed up for those things. And we are often wearing masks and our faces are covered. And I think that finding ways to feel desirable is really important because I think it has a big impact on our mental health. And also, people are having a lot less sex across the board during this period of time. Like at the beginning of quarantine, there was like a bajillion articles on the internet about how like everyone is so horny in quarantine, and like Amazon's running out of vibrators, which I guess was true. Like at the very beginning of lockdown, like Amazon ran out of vibrators, which is funny. But I think like for me and the people I knew, it was actually kind of making us feel worse, because I was like, why aren't I having more sex and like masturbating myself into oblivion? Like, should I buy a new vibrator? Like, and then for my podcast, I interviewed this Dr. LeMiller, his name is, and he works at the Kinsey Institute, which is, you know, like this iconic sex research center. And he was saying that while the media has been covering this sort of like sexual boom during this period, the reality is that across the board, single and in couples, people are having way less sex. Like 75% of couples reported to having less sex than usual. And single people are obviously having less sex because like now having sex with a stranger, you're like, could kill yourself and your whole family. So it doesn't seem as fun. Or at least it seems more anxiety producing than usual. So I think that, you know, that is just to say that if you are feeling bad or down about yourself because you like don't feel the best you've ever looked, or don't feel the best about yourself because of the sort of changing way that you exist in the world, or if you're not having sex as much, that you are not the only one. This is a sort of new normal, to use a word, to phrase that's so overused that it makes everybody feel nauseous. So I want to talk about dating in this era of social distancing, which I'm sure a ton of you are kind of navigating. And I think that, you know, not to be a downer, but there is a lot lost while having to have your dates, you know, walking the streets at an awkward distance apart from someone that you just met, or not being able to touch as freely and all these things. But I also truly believe that there are things to be gained from these experiences, and things that that you can learn about yourself, as annoying as learning about yourself can be at various points. And one of the most interesting factors or facts, ideas, whatever, that I have felt throughout this period is specifically around delayed sexual interaction with new people that are dating, right? And like I said, people who meet and are like in new relationships now, the amount of time between meeting and having sex or having any kind of sexual interaction is like far greater than in the past. And like, we are of a generation, or like me, millennial, and like you guys, probably most of you, whatever you guys are calling yourselves, let's be real, like we are not of generations who are used to dating without sex. And part of this is because we're lucky. Like the sexual double standard is finally beginning to fade in our culture. Specifically, we've made so much progress in that department. Like now more than ever, like as a woman, you can have a ton of sexual autonomy. You can have date around without as much risk. Like I'm not saying that slut shaming isn't still a problem, but really we are in a time when, at least I have felt, completely capable of having the sex life I want without feeling shamed or ostracized. And even if you look at like the reclaiming of the word slut and like the feminist inclusion of the sex worker community, I mean, this spans many different, like this is, I guess, exists in the world in many different forms. And that is a huge gain for us and for our society, and for men as well, or people of any gender, right? But I think that we would be remiss to not acknowledge the fact that in that social progress, we also lost something. Like we have lost the experience of long-term courtship, most of us, right? Like we've lost the ability to see what it feels like to have sex with someone after you've already dated them for a long time, or in love with them. I mean, not everybody, but I think, I mean, me and like the people I know who are maybe like more slutty than the average, but that this is not a common experience. And I think that being forced into that can actually potentially be an opportunity for growth. Because like sex, while very fun and exciting, and like sometimes having sex with like a stranger or, you know, like relative stranger on dates 1 or 2 or 3 can be really fun. I think that sex can also be a crutch. Um, to me, I've always felt like sex is a shortcut to intimacy in ways that are beneficial and not, right? Like, I think that there's something I've always found so exciting about the fact that, like, you can meet somebody in a bar or whatever, or a meetup from Tinder or wherever, and be having that sort of like awkward, like exciting, vulnerable first conversations. And then a few hours from then, like if you have sex with them, it can be in this period where you're like lying naked together, cuddling in like that kind of like post-sex haze where you feel like you could say anything. And like the pace with which you can feel that level of like intimacy and like positive vulnerability and openness is kind of incredible. And that's something that I've, you know, liked at various points in my life. But it can also be used to like jump over or to like ignore the fact of whether or not you even like somebody. You know what I mean? Where it's like it can be very easy. Like I've always like made the joke that to me an awkward silence is more vulnerable than like having sex with somebody. Like, of course, not always, but like I have been in these situations when you're on a date and it's kind of getting to that point where like no one knows what to say. And if you like put your hand, or it's like not going that well, or maybe you're not getting along, or you realize you don't have that much in common. And if you kind of like brush their thigh with your hand, that like sex can become the way in which you relate. And then you can end up having sex with someone a handful of times before you realize that actually maybe I don't like this person, or that the way this person treats me outside of these exciting sexual interactions doesn't make me feel good. And sort of what happens on a date when you don't have that crutch? What happens when you can't have sex? What happens when you touch and you're like left with this potentially more vulnerable for our generations of people who have never done this vulnerable position of having to like look someone in the eye for an extended period of time and talk. And maybe sex does become more special if you have to wait. Maybe not. Like maybe you'll have to wait a ton during this period of time, and then you'll be like, from now on I want to only have sex after 45 minutes because I'm sick of this delayed gratification thing. But I mean, from personal experience, I dated this guy once a handful of years ago, and he said right up front, like, I've never liked having sex with people very soon. It makes me feel bad. Like, spoiler, I actually like my dick can't, because I like have erectile dysfunction unless I feel really comfortable with someone. So it's like my body and mind are both telling me no. And we ended up waiting a month to have sex. And I was calling him my boyfriend before we ever had sex. And like we had like done like kissing and touching before that, but this is an entirely new experience for me. And the first time we had sex, I was like, wait, sex is meaningful? Like, I mean, not really. I know sex is meaningful, but it was just, it felt different. And is it better? I don't know, but it's different. It's like, I think we're cutting ourselves off from different kinds of emotional, relational, and sexual experiences if all of the ways that we meet people sort of like follow a same pattern. And in terms of vulnerability, I know like I have friends who have been FaceTime dating, and it's interesting. This one girl that I interviewed on the podcast was saying how she also, you know, is someone who has sex with people often on the first date or second date. And now she's like seeing people on FaceTime because she's like sort of on the more cautious level of spectrum. She's like hasn't felt comfortable meeting people in person very much. And she was saying that even on dates like 5 or 6, she doesn't feel comfortable having sex on FaceTime. And I was like, why? And she was saying that she thinks date 5 FaceTime sex is more vulnerable than date 1 in-person sex, because I think it's like you really have to show up. I think that we can in person kind of get drunk and turn the lights off and like face away from somebody and not be as present as when you have to sit there and really see somebody, and which is like scary and one of those things where you're like, oh, do I have to? But again, I think that these are things that people can take going forward post this experience. And then I know that there's like something else I wanted to talk about was just the ethics of dating during this period of time, which I know are complicated. Like basically, hold on, I'm looking at my notes because like I can't remember anything. So, okay, so there's always an ethical component to dating, obviously, right? Like I think that in the best of times, we all want to do our best to be not manipulative or not mean, or to be honest. But then I also think that, you know, now we're adding so much like moral and social responsibility into the mix and so much judgment. And now these things are more complicated than ever. And I think personally, I was kind of looking back on my life when I was dating, and something I always struggled with was how much I owed someone transparency in the arena of like whether or not I'm dating other people, if I'm sleeping with other people, because unless you've like spoken exclusivity, how, you know, you're kind of navigating like how much transparency do I owe you, but how much privacy am I granted for myself and in my own life? And now it's like, do I have to tell somebody if I like got my nails done? You know, like, do I have to tell somebody that I am going on a date with and potentially getting to the point where we're going to each other's house and sleeping together, that like I have a house cleaner come over, like and you know, more extreme, like, can you date two people at once and how do you navigate that? So I think, you know, it's kind of, I'm asking all these questions that I literally don't have the answer to, so I'm sorry, but like, I think that point being that communication is a skill that we are all going to get better at during this period of time. And something I find so interesting is that because it's more difficult to date multiple people at once, that people are being pushed toward monogamy faster. Like I have this friend who is a sex worker and poly, and her whole life has just been like literally like iCal scheduling sex because she's so busy. And then she, you know, she lives in New York, and when lockdown happened, I mean, New York more than ever anywhere, they had to be so careful. And she wasn't working, like she wasn't doing sex work because it was just way too dangerous. And, you know, everybody, her clients and her didn't want to do that. And she had just started dating this new guy, and she kind of had to pick like, who am I going to see? And then so she ended up being in this sort of like default monogamous relationship for like 5 months. And only now is kind of, you know, they're seeing other people. But she was just like, I have never done that. I've never only slept with one person for 5 months of my whole life, you know, and she's in her late 20s. And that there's vulnerability in that, and there's commitment in that, and that it's a learning experience. And it's like, it's kind of, this whole period of time is like a bit of a TBT, you know, it's like, or we're like going back to the mid-century or something. It's like, I'm literally learning to sew. Like, who would have thought? Like, we're cooking, we're gardening, we're staying at home more, and like we're waiting longer to have sex, we're being more monogamous. And I think that it can be kind of an identity crisis. Like specifically, I feel like Gen Z, like I feel like all you guys are like addicted to being poly, like in my experience. So I feel like for you guys, it must be like, who am I without, I don't know, it's almost like potential for a more progressive sexuality, execution of sexuality, execution of relationship styles, of sexual performance. And I think it's forcing us like inside, literally like inside of our houses, but also inside in terms of our intimate and personal experiences of ourselves and of our lives. And that is such an interesting, that while it can be like annoying and like self-discovery is like suck sometimes, that like, that it's to not pass it up. Like there's this quote I love from like, it was like Obama's, somebody who worked for Obama, I'm the worst, but it was just like, never pass up the opportunity of like a good crisis. Like in crisis, there is always something to be gained and learned. And that's that's what I have for my rant. I hope that was helpful. And we can move on to questions if that was okay.
Yeah, that was great. It was really interesting hearing your takeaway or like generalized takeaway from after listening to all the episodes of your podcast. There's definitely some things that like that you brought up that I also marked down to that I thought was really that resonated with me really strongly or made me think about stuff in a new way. Definitely, I can relate a lot to when you talked about how difficult it is to feel desirable when you're just like sitting around in sweatpants all day, and how I didn't realize how important it was to me to be able to like dress up and go out, even if I like hate being creeped on or sometimes feel uncomfortable with people's gazes. It's just like it's hard to even feel like sexy at all or have it goes into my libido, like just feeling gross.
Yes. And then you feel complicated about it too, because you're like, am I hypocritical? I'm like, don't objectify me. But also when no one's looking at you, you're like, hello, like, you know what I mean? And then also there's just like this other component where like I got my hair dyed yesterday, like outside with fucking, sorry, like, and 95 masks and face shields and wind blowing at us. And I hadn't had my hair dyed in 8 months. And I had like an ombre, like non-consensually. And I started just to feel really bad about myself. I was like, I don't like the way I look. And then you have this feeling of like, oh my God, people are dying. People are losing their lives and their jobs. And I'm sitting here thinking about my roots. Like, this is not like, I'm a moral monster, you know? So it's kind of difficult to like, feel like, what am I allowed to feel bad about? But I do think feeling like sex is like an enormous part of being human. Being touched is so important. Like, you know, a bajillion studies for many years show that lack of touch has a huge impact on mental health. So I do think that we can't just say like, oh, it's a pandemic, so just put yourself on the back burner because, you know, your mental or sexual health on the back burner because, you know, there are bigger things to worry about. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean, but I think that there's, especially from listening to all your conversations, I think that there's so many different aspects to being a social creature, and that like there's not really a way to exist in the world and not be seen at all. So it makes sense, but it's difficult to balance because it does seem like not the most important of things. And there's so much other things happening right now. But yeah, just like not being seen, it adds to how lonely and stressful it is to be in quarantine. I forgot to mention that if you have any questions for Karley, please feel free to post them in the YouTube chat. Because we'll do like a Q&A later. I have a question for you. Your writing involves a lot of sharing of personal, intimate details of your life. And in one episode, you talk about it being easier for you to talk about sex in front of an audience because it feels less vulnerable when you're curating word by word and crafting your own story about your experiences, and how that isn't necessarily the same as telling people everything or just being completely about feeling no fear and opening up. And I thought that was interesting considering like the style of writing involved with the personal blog facet of electronic literature, which you're kind of on like the cutting edge of. And I wonder, how did you get started writing about sex and love, and has it always been the case?
That's an interesting question. It's like, I do think that's true. There's this Joan Baez quote who's like this thing, you know, like female singer from like the 60s, 70s, I guess. And she was like, I feel more comfortable in front of an audience of 10,000 than I do one-on-one. And I think it's because, again, it just comes back to vulnerability. It's like having to act like specifically with the internet, it's this barrier. I mean, it's the same reason why people feel comfortable sexting, why like teens sext, but like when they see that person in class, they just pretend that they've never seen them before. You know what I mean? Because the medium is so detached. And in a lot of ways, I mean, I think that when I read other people's words online, they're really meaningful to me. And I do feel like that words matter, even if they're not spoken to my face, of course. But for me, it's like I can just be working in the privacy of my own home, saying and divulging these things that I think I would be kind of embarrassed to say to a stranger in person. But because I can just like upload it onto my computer and like forget about it and not have to be there when these things like about whatever like sexual insecurity I have, or talking about like jealousy or like whatever, like vagina problems, which is like a topic that I'm always ranting about, like that it's more embarrassing to have to sort of like sit and see those words like resonate on someone's face. And I think, yeah, like I was saying, that people say shit online they will not say in person, as we see more and more and more with the kind of hate that people fling around online, right? And I do feel like I've always had that experience. I started writing about sex I started writing, I guess, when I was like 21. I started my blog, Slut Ever, when I was like in 2007. This was like when blogs were new.
Yeah.
And the internet looked like crazy. Like blogs, they always had like it was the background screen was black and the writing was like Comic Sans, like pink or like a lighter color. People like hadn't worked out like what the internet should look like yet. And I was living at the time in this squatted commune in London. I had like moved to London, then dropped out of college, and then like was broke and was living in like squatting is sort of more common in London because it's not a criminal offense. So there's like kind of larger communities of like art students like making so-called art and squatting, but the art never really appears and the sort of drugs appear. But anyway, point being, I started this blog as a way to just sort of like practice writing. And I was writing about everything that was going on in the squat and that sort of community. And I started writing about sex because it's something that I've always been interested in. I think probably because if you grew up like Catholic and you're told not to have sex, you're like, suddenly it becomes the most interesting thing that's ever happened. You know, like being told no is really like, you know, there's nothing more exciting in a way. But so I started writing, and like at the beginning it was like to an audience of 0. You know what I mean? Like blogs weren't a thing. There was no sort of model for turning your blog into a career. There was no such thing as like a famous or like professional blogger. And then as it gained traction and I realized that I was writing for an audience, it kind of was like I don't think that I had the same framework where now we have all of these conversations about the internet being a place where people act in ways that they wouldn't in person. And I did feel like but I kind of subconsciously or unconsciously formed this sort of online identity that didn't always necessarily align with like who I actually am. Again, it's about like performance. You know what I mean? Like sometimes it's like, who am I online? Who am I in person? Who am I when I'm out in the world? Like, who am I when no one's watching? Does that make, I feel like I don't even like, now I'm like, am I answering the question?
I think that I feel that way too when I'm writing. Like my favorite thing about writing is that you can put in things that people, that it would be weird if you just like brought up with people you just met, but like that confessional aspect is really cool. And that definitely makes sense. And it's super interesting, the like landscape of the internet when you first started writing. In your book, you talk about when you're talking about reclaiming the title slut, you talk about getting like slut shamed online as like a woman and a writer talking about sex. Is that something you mostly experience online, or have you dealt with that a lot in person as well? Is it like that online barrier where people feel like they can say things that they wouldn't to your face, or has that been difficult like in person?
You're right. Like it is mostly online. I definitely experienced some of it in high school. There's like this thing I read about in my book that like in high school, it was like, I can't remember if it was, I think it was the prom, but maybe it was homecoming. Like one of my, he wasn't really one of my friends. He was just like one of the guys in my grade had like went to the prom with like this blow up sex doll, like as a joke.
That's so embarrassing.
I know, embarrassing for him. But then like afterward, we were at this party, like an after prom party, and everyone was drunk, and he like, I can't remember if he like wrote my name on the doll or just like said that it was me, and then like everyone was like passing it around or something. It's like sounds like it's from a teen movie, like it sounds like a bad scene from a teen movie. But
That's
I
really mean.
no, it's right. I was like, this will be fodder for my future book. No, but it was. I remember like registering, even at that time, in my sort of 17-year-old brain, like that there was a factor about my sexuality that made those people uncomfortable, you know? And especially like young boys, so much of it is that they're insecure or want to be having sex that they don't have access to in high school, and being intimidated by women or feeling like women have more sexual power when they're, you know, at a younger age. But that's like my main like sort of in-person slut shaming memory. But I have had just sort of like stupid things online or things that are sent to me to my like work email address that's published on the internet. But I have to say that one amazing skill I have, if any, is not really being personally brought down by that kind of stuff, because I just feel like you got to see it for what it is. It's like, what losers are online being like, guess what? Like, I'm going to really get her this time. You know what I mean? It's like, what? It says so much more about like, I think when it comes to shaming, it says so much more about the person doing the shaming than the person being shamed, right? Because like, what does this bring up in you to make you feel so triggered or angry or insecure? And it's always so basic too. It's like, you're a whore. It's like, good one. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it definitely says more about their ideas about sex and relationships than it has anything to do with like you personally.
Yeah.
It seems like you must have a really good therapist because you talk about things she said several times in your podcast. And one of those moments is in your episode on what's up or down with my corona libido, when you talk about shifting from an achievement-oriented focus for sex to one that's like more relaxed and forgiving and more about showing up for your partner, even if you might not feel like it, or about like not always having the expectation that you both have to have orgasms or stuff like that. And I thought that was really interesting. Like the idea that you don't have to have high expectations. And I think that's something that like, it was really interesting. It tracked across different episodes as well. And an idea that it seems like might stay like after the pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. So that, I don't remember that I said that, but sounds smart. But like, there's this cliche that like disappointment comes from expectation, right? Like the sort of like classic example people use is like vacations are really stressful and disappointing often for people because you have this expectation of like, this is going to be the greatest moment of my life. And then it never is. Or like, it's why New Year's Eve sucks so much, because like you have all this expectation of how fun it's going to be and it never can match that. And I think that like, I remember this conversation with my therapist. It's like when we go into sexual experiences feeling like it needs to be a certain way, or it needs to be this good, or like that this is what has to happen for it to be like good, then for one, we're like laying the groundwork to be disappointed. But also two, it robs you of your ability to be present and to kind of go with the flow and the spontaneity of the moment. If you're like, oh my God, well, you know, if like he has to go down on me if I go down on him, or like, you know, if I don't come twice, or, you know, we should be doing something new than we did before, or whatever it is, right? That I think that it's hard, right? Like it's like easier said than done, but being able to be present and showing up for what's actually happening is so much more exciting. And then I remember her saying this one thing where it's like, sex doesn't always have to be like the greatest thing ever. You know what I mean? Like sometimes, especially, you know, like, well, you know, learning from being in a relationship, it's like sometimes you have sex and you're like kind of tired, or sometimes you have sex and you're like, maybe you're feeling a little bit anxious because of something that just happened. And like, these are all valid experiences. You know what I mean? It's not always going to be 10 out of 10, but it's kind of actually nice to give yourself that flexibility. And the worst component, like the sort of worst outcome, in my opinion, about this is that when something isn't meeting your expectations, that you perform in order to create the illusion that like it is, right? So the most obvious example for me is like faking orgasms. Like I recently wrote this article for Vogue, like why do we fake orgasms? And it's just sort of linked, it's kind of an entryway to talking about like sexual performativity in general. And I think for me, for years and years, I always felt like, oh, well, if you don't come, then something's wrong with you. Or if you don't come, then the guy's going to feel bad about himself. Or it just like the sex wasn't good. Or that this was like integral to having the sex be like good, whatever, like good. Like we have these like arbitrary standards. And so often I would like fake it, and, you know, like you're like moaning gets louder and louder, and then you fake it to kind of create this inauthentic experience. And like now it's like once you stop faking orgasms, like when I was 30, I was like, I gotta go fucking cold turkey on this. Like once you get to the other side, you're like, what was I doing? Like beyond, like people say it's like not feminist, like blah blah blah, who cares? And I'm not shaming people who do it because I completely understand the impulse, but it's more like you're just lying to yourself and the other person, and it's kind of sad and lonely. And I think a great way to think about it is like, imagine if someone was doing it to you. Like you can kind of delude yourself, like, oh, I'm performing, like, oh, well, I'm faking an orgasm, which is going to make him or her or them feel better about themselves because like they think that they like made me come. And it's like, imagine someone did that to you. It's so insulting. It's like robbing you of the honesty or authenticity of an experience. And it also like kind of presumes that your ego is so great that you like can't just be understanding that of the fact that maybe the other person just like couldn't get there this time, and that it's not like evidence that you're shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
definitely.
I think the kind of goal of every sexual experience, in my opinion, is just to like connect. And I think performativity is like a hurdle to connection, basically.
Mhm. How did you get started writing as a columnist for Vogue?
Good question. I had like been writing my blog for, at that point, probably like, I don't know, 5 years or something. And I had kind of evolved, you know, my blog became more focused around sex a few years in, because I moved to New York basically when I was 24, and I've been writing the blog for a few years, and I like didn't have a college degree or like any prospects at all. So, or any money. So I started assisting this dominatrix because I had interviewed her. And then she basically asked if I wanted to just like sit in on her sessions, and she'd pay me $50 an hour to just watch. Cause like her clients would pay more if someone was watching, cause it kind of ups the like humiliation factor. And I was like, I just sit here and like watch you pee on people, $50 an hour. Like this is the greatest job ever. So then, and then it kind of like that experience for me sparked like rather than kind of writing like personal stories about sex or my relationships, like personal essays, it sparked like an interest in the psychology around sexuality, because it was sort of like, why do these people want this, and like, what are they getting out of it, and like, why do you want to be like ridden around like a horse, or like, why do all these Hasidic Jews like to be dressed up in women's underwear, which like seemed to be like a very common thing that was happening. And like, um and like, no judgment of any of this, but it's just like there seemed to be real common themes, and that she was, and that the dominatrix, like, and her clients had such this really deep connection, because like they wanted something so specific, she could provide it. It was like this mutual appreciation, and it didn't feel like the money was kind of an impediment to this connection, which I thought was interesting. So I started interviewing them, the clients, and I started interviewing her, and then it kind of sparked this sort of wider interest in like, well, why does anyone want anything, sexually? And it kind of moved from being more of like a ranty blogger to more of a sex journalist, I guess you would say. And then I think, Vogue at the time was looking to get someone to write about sex and relationships. It was back in 2012, and they didn't cover it at the time. And I think they just kind of reached out to me being like, do you want to start trying to write about this topic for us? But maybe like leave out like the peeing and stuff, because we're sort of like a very commercial mainstream brand. I was like, I think I can do that.
That's really awesome. Or it makes me think of The Devil Wears Prada whenever I think about like that position that you have. Yeah, like is writing for Vogue anything like that? Or does it feel glamorous? Or is it just like now that magazines are suffering so much, it's kind of like do you feel that at all as a columnist?
Yeah, well, basically, it's interesting. Like, Vogue is a sort of microcosm for the world. The amount that it's changed in the 6 years that I've been writing for it, or maybe like 7, is amazing. Like when I started, it was more Devil Wears Prada than, like, I saw the comparisons. Like I would go to I write from home, but I would go to the office, and like all the girls, there was a lot of white girls, and everybody had to wear heels.
Wow.
And it was like the magazine floor was one floor, all the women and gay men basically who wrote for the magazine were on one floor, and then all the people who wrote for the internet were like on the basement floor, and like people didn't care, like they made less money and no one cared about the internet back like in 2012 or 13 or whatever. And then and as time has gone by, the culture of Vogue has changed so much. Like now, it used to be this kind of like uptight, like white ladies basically, and now it's way younger, way more queer, way more culturally diverse. No one gives a fuck if you're wearing heels or not. And I think that it's like representative of what the culture at large wants and relates to. But I will say that, people speaking to people who are writers or interested in writing, that, yeah, man, like magazines don't have that much money, and it's really difficult to make money, like make enough money that way, especially like as an adult, and it sucks, like, you know what I mean? And people are writing books, and yeah, I'm like trying to move toward writing for TV because it's a better way of making, there's potential to make more money. But I know a lot of people who write for like, whatever, the website for an app, and then also can do journalists on the side, or like that you can do like more commercial writing in order to support your creative writing, or just like to not feel any shame in not making that much money writing while also having another job. That is like so normal and not very necessary for a lot of people.
You've written across like many forms of media, online magazines, TVs, and podcasts. I guess, are you moving towards TV just because it's like a bigger market, or is there a form out of the ones that you have that you've worked in that feels the most exciting or natural?
I think that like what's exciting is change, right? Like I just have been writing, so I've written so many personal essays that like truly in the past couple years I've been like, I'm so sick of myself. Like if I have to write about any more of my own thoughts or experiences, like I'm gonna die. So there's been something really exciting in being able to create other worlds or other characters, which are obviously like so formed out of your own life experiences and ideas and passions. But it's just been nice to get out of myself and not be so literal. And the money's a factor too, but like, but it's just like, you gotta like change stuff up, you know? It's hard to do the same thing over and over.
So it seems like we have a question from the audience, but I'm dying because it's like obvious that my dad has asked this question.
Oh,
He's a big fan of yours because he's seen, oh, we have another one. Great. Okay. But now I have to do it. Now I have to talk about this because we've already gone into it. He's like a really big fan of yours because of your from your Viceland show.
that's cool.
I guess that that's like did you go into that knowing that it would be a that like he's divorced and like older man, and I feel like that is a really big audience for the show, or like a market that they struck, that like the hour that they play it at night, they replay episodes. Did you do it knowing that that was the audience that it would appeal to, or did you notice that or something?
That first of all, it's true that that was a big audience for the show, and I was shocked. So basically, for my whole life, the only people who ever cared about what I was saying was like young women, right, and like some gay guys. And I'm sure there was like a couple straight guys out there, but like they were mostly sending me like slut shaming emails. You know what I mean? And so, what was interesting about making this Viceland show, which was like this, I made a couple seasons of this documentary series that explored like sex and sexual taboo, and it was like funny, and we did everything from like sex robots to like sex and weed and blah blah blah. But Viceland as a network has their majority of their audience is like middle-aged men. So it just turned out that a lot of people watching it were middle-aged men. It was like after that happened for the first time in my life, like there would be like construction workers eating at the diner, and then they'd be like, "Oh, I really like your show," and I was like, "What?" It was like so insane, and I think that it just made me think like, oh, this is really cool. And there is something about the fact that in the sexual conversation, like the progressive sexual conversation, like we need more diversity, but like not the way we normally talk about like diversity. We need more like like men and like older men and straight men, like that those people, it benefits everybody if those people are learning about sex, part of a sexually progressive conversation, because it's like it's hard for society to make leaps forward if like if you're like preaching to the choir. Basically, I'm not saying that like I like changed the world talking about like weed lube to like your dad, but I do think that, you know, to kind of make it like an adjacent point, when it comes to sex and when it comes to feminism, that like we should, I think, be like wrangling people and be really inclusive rather than being like, oh, well, you're a straight guy, so like you've had your time to speak, shut up. You know, not that they should like talk over everybody, but that inviting everybody into the conversation, I think, is like ultimately helps everyone.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. We have another question. How do you think we can explore sexuality and the ways being poly often does while in quarantine, where we're either single or in a committed relationship? Can we replicate that freedom?
It's interesting. Like one of the episodes of the show was about the ethics of the podcast was about the ethics of dating. It's called "Is It Worth the Risk?" And you might want to listen to it because we interviewed this like single guy who's dating and kind of being more monogamous, but then we also interviewed this woman who was like a mother, recently divorced mother in the Midwest, who was like trying to explore her kind of like new poly identity during this period of time. And it was kind of interesting, like, this is some context. She was like, I got married super young. I had kids young. And I got divorced a year ago. And I just, for the first time, have felt like a year ago, like, so a year before quarantine happened. She was like, this was like the first year of my life that I felt like I finally realized that I was interested in non-monogamy, and I was like exploring my sexuality really like be outside of this committed relationship for the first time as an adult. And I felt so exciting, and I felt liberated, and I felt like I was getting over my shame about being like a woman who wants sex with multiple partners. And then she was like, and then quarantine happened, and I felt like, on top of sort of like the external and internal slut shaming that I felt my whole life, now I'm being shamed for like the moral, like the sort of morality of doing this during a pandemic as well. So it's like shame on top of shame, right? And I think that like even in young progressive circles, like I'm sure that most people on this Zoom exist in, that there still is that kind of stigma to an extent about people who sleep around, specifically, you know, like non-men who sleep around, and also about having multiple sexual partners, like sometimes, or being poly, like that can make people uncomfortable. And now on top of that, I'm sure you're feeling judgment because of the danger that this could potentially put you and other people in. And the thing is about like non-monogamy is that like at the best of times it involves like more conversations than humanly possible, right? Like you have to fucking talk through everything with everybody. And I'm like, dude, I can even handle one boyfriend. Like I can't imagine having like 4 or 2. But that, like we were talking about before, that it's like it's like the extreme sports of communication. Like you really have to be more honest than ever, be more skilled at having difficult conversations than ever. And also I think that it's a lesson in really only including people into your life who you really trust. Because that person, if you don't feel like they're being honest with you, then you're not only putting yourself at sort of like an emotional risk, but also a physical risk. And then you're putting your other partners at a physical risk as well. So I think the challenge, first of all, I think the reality is that everybody is sacrificing things. And this is going to be something that is potentially you're not going to be able to do this in the same way. It sucks. Like in the same ways, like you can't have a birthday party the same way either. So I'm not saying like great communication means that you can just be back to normal. But I think that, eventually the world will go back to like some sort of normal and you can be like a slut again. But that in the meantime, to just like really, like you gotta only have the best people around you. And I guess that's like probably my only advice. Is that good advice?
I think so. At the beginning of your podcast, you talk about how a lot of your projects were like put on hold or because of the virus. Are things picking up again as far as that goes?
Kind of. Like I'm still, like a lot of people making like way less money than I used to be and like working less. And I think like it's taken me a lot of, conversations and therapy to kind of not personalize that and be like, oh my God, am I never going to work again? Am I a total failure? Like I can't get a job. Like I'm not making any money. Will I never make any money again? And then it's like, she keeps saying like, this is everybody's life. This is almost everybody's life. It's not your fault. It's not about you. Like so many industries have been put on hold. So many people are on unemployment. Like don't take this and run with it and like write a whole narrative that you're a total failure and you're going to be poor and on unemployment and that you're a shit artist or a shit writer. It's not the case. Although I can, believe me, feel like that about myself in many moments. This is just what everybody's going through. And then it's also like, if you've heard the term like compare and despair, I hear it all the time about like when you look at other people's Instagram and you're like, their life's better than mine. But
Yeah.
I think that this time more than ever, we really have to remind ourselves like people's Instagram is not real life. And so if it seems like everyone else is like getting back to normal and like whatever, being happy, and they're not, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that you'll be fine. And if you're not working right now, it's not because you're not desirable or you're not good at your job.
Oh, that's a really great point. And we have another question that I think I just figured out. Someone asks, Karley, do you see a need for one more new dating app for people who are open for C&M relationships, which I think means consensually non-monogamous, which is a word like I feel like Gen Z loves using our term.
Consensual non-monogamy, yeah, or ethical non-monogamy, right? That's
Yeah.
one I've heard before. A new dating app. I know that there's that dating app Field, right? It used to be called Thrinder, but then Tinder sued them, so then they changed it to be called Field, and it's just generally for more sexually open types of dynamics, right? Where it's like whether you're looking for like a unicorn or an open relationship or like kink, or that you're just, it's basically like a less judgmental zone than Tinder, which I guess you could argue, or like Hinge or whatever, that's more mainstream. But do we need another one? I mean, how many do you need? You know what I mean?
It feels like to me like there's a million different dating apps.
Yeah, like
But
it's really too many.
I think we're about there on our time. Thank you so much for joining us. It was really fun to talk to you, and I think I definitely recommend listening to Karley's podcast, or reading anything she's written, because it all kind of gets to this key part of humanity, which is loneliness, or the need for or our need for other people in our lives. And I think that's relevant for everybody, but especially now when things are really difficult.
So nice of you. Thank you so much. I've also really enjoyed this. I hope it was useful.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Heidi, so much. This was so much fun, and I really enjoyed chatting with you.
All right. And thank you to our viewers. And good night.
Bye.